Hey there, this is Jexy with the Systems Alliance, and in this video we're going to go over the box office history of the Star Trek franchise, as well as the future that's in doubt right now, as Chris Pine and Chris Hemsworth may not be able to be in the next movie due to budget issues. So as everyone knows, Star Trek is one of the most popular sci-fi properties in the history of the world. Between the multiple television shows and the movies and everything else, the video games, there's so much Star Trek stuff out there. It's surprising that the movies don't actually make more money than they do. Amongst the, sci-fi community or the geek community, you would think Star Trek is always one of the top ones out there. And it is, if you include all of the TV shows and everything else that they do. But for whatever reason, the films don't pull in as much money as your DC or Marvel or Star Wars or anything like that. And that's actually causing an issue right now, because Chris Pine and Chris Hemsworth are supposed to be back in this new film, in where Chris Pine's Captain Kirk has some time-traveling stuff to where he ends up visiting with his father, Chris Hemsworth, who played his father in the first film in 2009 Star Trek. All of those negotiations have fallen through because the studio is trying to keep a really tight budget in light of the last movie's performance, which actually lost money. And it doesn't look like at this point they're going to be in the movie. Now, negotiations may have fallen apart, but as anyone that pays attention to movies or sports knows, negotiations can always start back up again. So there is still hope for that, but the problem is that both of them have such star power. Paramount at this point just can't afford them with the rest of the money that goes into a Star Trek film. Me personally, I don't think it matters if Chris Hemsworth is there or not. Obviously he's a great actor, obviously he played Captain Kirk's father in the original movie, and yeah, he'd probably be great in this movie, but I think he's pretty replaceable. One, he's not Captain Kirk. Two, he wasn't in the first movie for that long, so people don't really remember that, oh yeah, he was the father. So I think he's very recastable. I mean, they can get a good actor out there who looks sort of similar, or at least looks like he could play Captain Kirk's father, at least from a looks perspective. And I don't know how much money he was wanting, but obviously being Thor in the Marvel movies, he's a pretty big star right now. So he's either playing a really big part, or you're paying him a lot of money to play a small part. Chris Pine is the key one though. I think they really need him. He is the perfect Captain Kirk to me. 2009 Star Trek to me is easily the best Star Trek film ever made. And to be honest, one of the best science fiction films ever made. And personally, one of my favorite films of all time. I love that 2009 Star Trek. And last night I watched Star Trek Into Darkness, and that's a really good film too. Yeah, Khan was played by Benedict Cumberbatch, who, while he's a great actor, people want someone kind of like the first Khan, but to me it doesn't matter. That film is a really good movie and a really fun Star Trek film. The visuals are amazing, which is probably why it costs so much, but to me, if you stack those Star Trek films up, any of the new 3 ones against the new Star Wars films, I think the Star Trek films are better, and actually by kind of a lot. I know no one really liked Solo, and also no one really liked The Last Jedi, but there's still been some other Star Wars films out there that made a crazy amount of money, but personally the Star Trek ones are kind of where it's at for me. So hopefully they're going to pay up for Chris Pine, because without him, I don't even know who you get to replace him as Captain Kirk. I feel like the whole movie franchise falls apart as it currently is. I think it's pretty much done at this point. I know they say they're already moving on to negotiations with the other actors, but in this case it's kind of done, because he's so great as Captain Kirk, you can't replace that. Let's go into the Star Trek series and see how they ranked box office wise. And this will be with inflation adjusted. So this is not what they made back then. This is what they would make in today's dollars. So they've made 13 movies, and sitting in at number 13 is Star Trek Nemesis. Now, despite having one of the coolest titles for any Star Trek movie or any movie in general, it unfortunately only made $106 million worldwide. So not a huge earner, and kind of spelled the end for Star Trek and that series of movies. Star Trek Nemesis was definitely the lowest grossing of any of the Star Trek films. Coming in at number 12 is Star Trek V: The Final Frontier with $147 million. So definitely a lot more than Nemesis, but still actually pretty far off from number 11. So while The Final Frontier in 1989 wasn't really The Final Frontier because there was a sixth movie in 1991, 2 years later, there was actually a big recovery box office wise from 5 to 6. Because Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country, actually comes in at number 11 on the list with $214 million. So as you can see, there's some pretty big gaps, 40, 50 million, 60 million between these movies down in this area. And one thing to point out on all of these movies is that the foreign gross is very, very small. It's a very small percentage of the overall gross of the movie. Some of that can be common, especially with the older movies that we actually really haven't gotten to yet, where stuff was just not marketed overseas like it is here. But in general, with big franchises, you do see at least around a 50-50 split. At worst, maybe a 60-40 domestic versus international take. But with these Star Trek films, you're looking at, in some cases, more of an 80-20 split, domestic to foreign, which is really unusual, but kind of shows the weakness, unfortunate weakness, of the Star Trek brand overseas. Coming in at number 10 is Star Trek Insurrection with $229 million. Now, this movie came out in 1998, and 229 isn't too bad. The budget wasn't super huge, so it didn't exactly lose money, but once again, this is adjusted. So we're talking Star Trek films, all of these pulling in the low 200s so far, and I know they're at the bottom of the list, but once again, that Next Gen series just didn't hold up very well at the box office. Coming in at number 9 is Star Trek III, The Search for Spock. The Search for Spock brought in $240 million, but once again, just to demonstrate the difference between domestic and overseas, out of the $240 million that movie made, $210 million of it was domestic. That's a crazy ratio. That's not something you normally see. That's something you see with normally these smaller release films that just simply don't get released overseas, but whatever Paramount or whoever was giving these movies out to the international crowd, either the marketing was bad or I'm not sure. And I understand that the original intent of Star Trek was a very, Kennedy-esque view of space and all this stuff, but I mean, we're well past that, and the movies have definitely changed, and that's not even the original series from the 60s anymore. I mean, this is 20 years later. So to me, it really is a mystery why it's not catching on overseas, especially in this early going. There is some improvement, though, with the Next Gen series as far as box office overseas goes, especially with number 8, with 1994's Star Trek Generations. And that brought in $265 million, with nearly $100 million being foreign. So not too bad, but still low totals overall. Its sequel in 1998, Star Trek First Contact, brought in $305 million. And that was actually more of a 2/3 to 1/3 split. And the first time that it broke $100 million in foreign, and it did it with $112 million. So some improvement there, but still, we're still in the $300 million range. So this is still pretty low in terms of the geek scale, in terms of all the other things that we see going on. Coming in at number 6 is what many used to say was the best Star Trek film ever made, the sequel to the first Star Trek film, Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. And although it made just a little bit more than the last one at $306 million, just to kind of put it in perspective of how poor the Star Trek films have done overseas, $249 million of the $306 million was domestic. So that's a pretty big hit in the United States, but once again, overseas it's just not doing it. But still, those movies, especially that first, first generation, since other ones are next generation, that first series of movies, the budgets were pretty low. We're talking maybe 20 million back then, so even if you make it 40 million or 50 million, they're still making a huge profit. So while Star Trek movies didn't necessarily bring in a ton of money, they were still bringing in a pretty big profit. And I think that kind of speaks to the issues that Paramount is now having with the two Chris's, because their budget is so high now, and a lot of it is really going to the CG. The CG is absolutely amazing. The worlds look real, the ships look real, the action looks real, and let's face it, they look a lot better than the original ones. Even the original TV series kind of made fun of for how low the budgets were. But we're serious now, so being serious in a sci-fi franchise tends to cost a lot of money. Up next, you have Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home, coming in at $324 million, and out of that $324 $324 million, $267 million was once again domestic. So big hit in the United States, not doing much overseas again. So despite them saying that the last movie lost money, which it did because it cost about $190 million to make, not even including marketing, we get into the number 4 spot, which is Star Trek Beyond, and that's the third one in this new trilogy of Star Trek films. It made $374 million, and $201 million of that was actually foreign. So we have gotten to the point where the Star Trek films have started to catch on a little bit overseas, but for some reason, at least in this third installment, the domestic take is really dropping. Now, while Beyond is a good movie, it got great critic reviews, and anyone who saw it had a good time, it doesn't really stick in your mind as one of the great Star Trek stories of all time, and for some reason, despite being a good movie, just didn't really click with people. It didn't make anyone say, yeah, you gotta see that Star Trek film, like maybe the other two were. So for whatever reason, this is kind of what Paramount is hanging their hat on as far as negotiations go, to say, hey, look, we can't pay you enough because these movies aren't making enough money, which is usually a great argument, but usually it's not because of the actors or anything like that. For some reason, story-wise or whatever, it's just not clicking with fans. It might not be the action they want or what they want to see, or maybe they've heard the story before, whatever it is, it's just not quite clicking with audiences. After that, we actually jump up to number 3 and jump up $100 million to 2009 Star Trek, which brought in $479 million. So the interesting part about this movie is that domestically, it holds the record for any Star Trek movie at $320 million. But once again, that's $320 million versus $159 million overseas for that total of $479 million. So even with the reboot, it still wasn't hitting overseas markets. Now it's picked up since then, as you can see, because even Beyond, which made just barely over half as much here as it did before, it did manage to make a little more overseas. And as I said before, it's still by far my favorite Star Trek film. And jumping up from there to the number 2 spot, we have the original Star Trek the Motion Picture, which if you've ever seen it, especially now, it's not that great of a movie. But at the time, it was the only thing that people had, and it also came around in 1979. So as far as number of movies in the theater, which was much lower than it is now, in addition to how long it would stay in the theater and just the whole vibe of, so it's Star Trek, the show we always used to watch on TV, now in the big screen, it was just kind of an event. And that jumped up from the $479 million of 2009 Star Trek up to $513 million. So over $500 million for the first Star Trek movie. But that would literally be the highest grossing by far until this new trilogy came out. For whatever reason, it did take a big drop. But even then, it was such an event that despite the other movies doing pretty terrible overseas, the original movie, while it did over $300 million domestic, did over $200 million international. So not a bad ratio, and had they continued that, the movies probably would have done a lot better. Number 1, though, with $5 million more, standing at $518 million, is Star Trek Into Darkness, the sequel that I just watched last night. And it didn't make as much domestic as the last 2 movies I just mentioned, but it's number 1 because of the foreign gross, and that's how important foreign gross is. It's one of the few to actually make more overseas than here. So while it made $254 million here, it made $264 million overseas. That's a winning combination to be the highest grossing Star Trek movie adjusted of all time. So let me know your thoughts on the Star Trek franchise as it stands. Are you worried that Chris Pine may not be back as Captain Kirk? If he's not back, are you even going to watch the new film? To me, it seems kind of pointless. They really have to lock him down. Chris Hemsworth, don't care about so much in the Star Trek franchise. Care about him as Thor, not as Kirk's dad. Are you surprised that the ranking adjusted of these movies? Are you surprised that they're not making more money overseas? And if so, why do you think they aren't making more money overseas? Star Trek is one of my favorite sci-fi properties of all time, so hopefully they can get it together over at Paramount, but as of right now, things are a little bit stalled, so we'll just have to see. Leave your comments down below. Be sure to subscribe, like, share this video, and we'll catch you next time.